Well, greetings and welcome back to our study on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. I left off last time talking about 1st Timothy 2, um, and we're going to pick up in verse 8 and go all the way through verse 15. I said last time that the discussion on prayer in 8 through 10 is a discussion on Paul saying, be respectable citizens and pray for people in a way that they will find you as respectful and good people. Trying not to be too big of an agitator or an activist in the wrong way. And that's pretty easy to understand with his instruction to men. Don't be argumentative in your prayers. Don't try to shine attention on yourself. What is less clear is the instructions for women that follow all of this from verse 9 all the way down to verse 15. These become a little more murky. Now, this video could very quickly get out of hand if I started to present all of the possibilities for this passage, because there are a lot of them. And as Philip Towner says in his commentary, anyone who approaches this passage as easy or straightforward doesn't really understand the passage very well, because it poses problems for everyone. There is just no clear-cut answer for what Paul is trying to say. And so we really should not read this passage as one that is our go-to for informing theology in a lot of ways, simply because it is not clear. I'm going to present what I think is the clearest, the clearest interpretation, the best interpretation, but even that is not very clear. There's still some problems. There's problems with every interpretation. So let's begin. In verse 9, Paul begins by talking about women who are doing their hair in gold and in pearls and wearing expensive clothing. And he says to the women that when you're praying, you should dress modestly. Now, this is, and we know he's talking about prayer because he's using words that are comparative to verse 8, where in the same way. In other words, the prayer from verse 8 continues on. He's actually legitimately talking about prayer for women and being upfront in a worship setting. So that is evident in the way that he structures verse 9, in the same way, or just as. It is saying that under the same conditions of the men that I've just presented, here, women, you do the same thing. Now, what is unclear is what it means by to be modest. In our modern culture, we usually associate modesty in dress with sexuality. We usually talk about the antithesis of modesty being overtly sexual. Paul is not talking about modesty as opposed to overt sexuality. Paul is talking about modesty over against riches and affluence, but also against this idea of the new Roman woman. Now, there is some level of sexuality in that, kind of a sexual freedom that would have been over against the traditional, more classical ideal of femininity, but that's not the main issue. The main issue is that, one, women are dressing in a way that is extravagant and calling attention to their status, and two, that might be appealing to this idea of a new Roman woman, the idea of a woman who is dominant and aggressive in a way that is very activist, very much I'm in control, take charge kind of person. Now, in other places in the New Testament, Paul talks freely about women exercising freedom and some measure of independence in their circle, in their world. What he is clearly going to write against here is the idea that these women are being antagonistic with their freedom. They're using it, they're flaunting it in a way that is causing people to see them purely as activists, as detrimental to society as a whole. And when we get to that level, then we've kind of crossed a line. And so what Paul is trying to say is, if the way you are dressing is going to cause people to think that you are an activist in this way, dress differently. Be a little more modest. Not in the sense of tone down the sexuality, but in a sense of tone down the extravagance, tone down the activist kind of appeal. Let people recognize that you are trying to be what is best for society, and not just a pure activist for the sake of being an activist. That is more of what he's trying to say. Let your attractiveness to this world be your good works, what you're doing. Again, he is not talking about sexual attractiveness. He is saying that let what appeals to the people, what people see when they see you, let that be not this rich lifestyle or this overly independent lifestyle. Let it be your good works. In other words, you will appeal to a wider range of people and to more people if you tone down this the style, and allow your love to flow through you in a way that you don't have to be the activist. You can show people the way in just your own good works. And this leads into verse 11, which then picks up a whole new can of worms. There are a lot of questions like, is Paul addressing a wife to a husband? Is he addressing a specific woman? Is he addressing women in general? Now, I don't think he's addressing women in general because of the way the verb structure works, and this is where we could get very, very technical. But the way the imperatives versus the normal tenses of verbs are structured, I don't think he's talking to women in general. I also don't think he's talking about a wife to a husband, although it could be that he is talking about wives to especially unbelieving husbands. A lot of people take that this way. I don't think that's it. I think he is continuing the topic of worship setting from verse 8, and he is addressing a group of women, a very specific group of women. And the first thing he says is an imperative. Let them learn. Let them grow. Let them learn and develop. Now, he's already talked about this is how women should speak in church. This is how they should behave when they are praying in church. Let them continue to learn. Let them grow and develop, but do so in quiet and submissiveness. Now, this is connected directly to learning. And what it seems to be saying is that these women who are being trained are talking back. They are doing things that are trying to demonstrate independence instead of just learning what they need to learn about Jesus. That, again, goes back to 1:5. Learning from a good teaching is a pure heart, a clean conscience, and love for others. They are not doing that. Instead, they are trying to interject themselves into what they are being taught, and they are trying to one-up the teacher. They have then become the false teachers. So the learn is in the imperative, and then it is qualified on how they should conduct themselves while they are learning, indicating that this woman or group of women, small group of women, are not learning in this way, but they should be. They should be learning. And they should be doing it quietly so that they know how to properly teach. Now, the next verse, verse 12, switches the verb tense, and it goes into a verb that is much more temporally located. In other words, it is much more culturally dependent. It is much more in that first that first group of people who are reading this. It is not an imperative, and it is not something that is an ongoing verb. It is not this is a command for all time kind of verb. It is rather very specific. And then it goes, but it says, a wife, I do not allow or permit, I would not allow or permit a woman, or this woman, maybe, this group, to teach or control a man. Now, again, he's just commented on their learning, and he's given the command that they should learn. And what he is doing here is switching that up to say, I would not allow this woman, these women, to talk back to a man. Not that they can't have authority. This is not a noun that says a position of authority, or as so many try to argue, this bars women from ministry. It doesn't. This is not a noun that is in any way talking about a position within the church. Paul is not saying that women can't have a position. He is saying that he doesn't allow women to teach in a way that is domineering or condescending to. He is very much saying that these women need to learn and grow, but that they need to do so quietly instead of talking back and acting like they know what they're talking about when they don't. This verse, 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12, these verses, if we read them as do not allow them to speak at all, it really creates a lot of problems for verse 9, which is already said when women pray. Same with 1 Corinthians. It talks about where women are supposed to cover their heads when they pray and worship. Romans 16, where we see that Paul has sent the letter of Romans with a woman, with Phoebe, who is supposed to carry the letter and teach it. Again, in Romans 16, if you look through the workers that Paul lists, most of them are women. If we understand this as barring women from ministry altogether and barring them from speaking, we have a severe problem with the rest of the New Testament, which clearly allows women to take on responsibilities within the church. In fact, later in this letter, we're going to see greet Prisca. Now, number one, Prisca is listed first over Aquila. That means she's the more important one. She is one who in Acts is said to have taught in Ephesus and taught Apollos, the apostle. Now, that line, calling to memory her role within the church and her position as a teacher, undermines any attempt to say that she shouldn't be allowed to speak, because if she's not allowed to speak, then Paul wouldn't go out of his way to greet her, somebody who has taken on that responsibility in this very city. He wouldn't have done it. He would have just blown past her name. He would not have called her out by name. He would have just called out her husband, or at the very least, he would have put her husband first. So the idea is not about a universal command against women in ministry. It is about these women who are imitating, at the very least, imitating the new Roman woman, whether or not they actually are part of this culture. They are imitating it they are speaking out of turn, when they don't know what's going on. And Paul is saying, let them learn, give them the chance to learn, give them a chance to grow, but by all means, quiet them, because they are abusing this right to learn and grow. Now, verses 13, 14, and 15 become difficult. No matter what way you slice it, it becomes difficult. There's an appeal to Adam created before Eve, Adam not being deceived, but it was Eve who was deceived. The idea seems to be that Adam, being created first, was given the message of God, given the message in Eden to say, this is how we live. And Eve, created second, did not hear that message completely, did not learn it completely. And because she didn't learn it completely, she was deceived. In other words, what was happening then is happening again. The woman then spoke before she was ready. These women are speaking before they are ready. Don't let what happened to Eve happen to them. The verse 15, though, is really confusing, because there's some plurals here about giving about being brought to faith, or being saved through bearing children. And this is really weird, because the plurals don't necessarily make sense with where with where Paul has been in verses 13 and 14. Being saved through childbearing doesn't make sense, except if we say that that the woman is saved through the birth of Jesus. So through the birth of the child, it really doesn't make complete sense. There's no easy way to read this, because Paul would never talk about salvation coming through childbirth. That contradicts a lot of his message about salvation coming through Jesus. The plurals don't really make sense with Eve as the subject, or the women in Ephesus. But it does seem most likely that what Paul is trying to say is that we're all saved, and especially women here, are saved through the birth of Jesus. Even though that doesn't really, even though it's difficult, that seems to be what he's saying, is that they are saved through the birth of Jesus if they continue in faith and love and holiness together with self-control. In other words, even though they're getting it wrong, if they continue to look to Jesus and continue to work out this salvation in faith and love, then they will end up in the right place. Again, a lot of this just is really complicated, and it doesn't make easy sense. And so we shouldn't build too much theology on this, because it really is difficult. Even in what I'm saying in this video, I'm oversimplifying a lot of the arguments. I'm brushing past some real kind of difficulties in the text itself, let alone the background and the context. But this is where I think that we are meant to land in this passage, is that Paul is speaking against a specific group of women who are being very ostentatious, who are being intentionally they are being intentionally activists in a way that is harming the reputation of the church. And what Paul was trying to say is, let them settle down a little bit. Let them commit themselves to some more modest behavior. Let them learn and grow and continue in faith and love into a position where they can take some authority within the church. They can take some positions of power, but let them do so at a slower pace because they need that. And right now they're not making the church look good, and what they need to focus on is making the church look good. And we're going to get to that in the very next chapter, in chapter 3, where we talk about the leadership of the church and what it means to be a leader in the church. And we're going to talk about how Paul is transitioning from verse 8 into the idea of leadership, and how leadership is going to reflect who the church is and what the church is about. So that'll be the next time. Until we meet again, God bless. As always, if you have questions, let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can deal with them. And have a great day.